There is a moment in every public battle where the person fighting stops reacting and starts executing. That is exactly where Deion Sanders is right now. This is not a father venting frustration on social media. This is not an emotional outburst from someone who does not understand how the league works. This is Coach Prime, one of the most calculated, media-savvy, strategically intelligent figures in the history of professional football, making a deliberate, public, and very serious set of accusations against the people who shape NFL narratives. And at the center of it all is his son, Shedeur Sanders, a quarterback whose pre-draft journey became one of the most talked about and controversial stories of the entire 2025 NFL draft cycle. To understand why Deion Sanders is this fired up, you have to understand exactly who Shedeur Sanders is and what the stakes actually were heading into the draft. Shedeur did not arrive at the pre-draft process as a nobody. He came out of the University of Colorado as one of the most scrutinized, most discussed, and most polarizing quarterback prospects in recent memory. He carried the enormous weight of his father's legendary name, a name that comes with expectations that would crush most people, while simultaneously trying to prove that his abilities stood entirely on their own. That is a nearly impossible balance to strike, and by most objective measures, Shedeur handled it with remarkable composure throughout his college career. But the pre-draft process is a different kind of battlefield entirely. It is not just about your arm strength, your footwork, or your ability to read a defense. It is about perception. It is about the stories that get told in boardrooms, on broadcast sets, and in the back channels of front office conversations. And somewhere during that process, a narrative took root about Shedeur Sanders, one that had very little to do with his football ability and everything to do with his character, his attitude, and whether he was, in the language that gets thrown around every draft season, the right fit for an NFL locker room. That phrase, right fit, is one of the most loaded, subjective, and consequential terms in all of professional sports. Once it starts circulating in connection with a prospect's name, it can do real, lasting damage to how organizations view that player. And according to Deion Sanders, that is exactly what happened to his son. The moment that crystallized everything for Deion came during a reported interaction between Shedeur and a team that had been genuinely interested in selecting him. The team had a concern. They described what they called the really bad play they had seen. Now, for any elite quarterback with the resume Shedeur had built, the expected response might be to push back, to provide context, to defend the film. Instead, Shedeur reportedly responded by saying, "Maybe I'm not the guy for you." That single sentence stopped Deion cold. Not because the response was wrong, but because of what it revealed. His son, a young man who had every reason to walk into that room with confidence, had been worn down enough by the surrounding narrative that he was questioning himself in front of the very decision-makers who held his professional future in their hands. To Deion, that moment was not a character flaw in Shedeur. That moment was the direct, measurable consequence of a poison narrative doing exactly what poison narratives are designed to do. So Deion went looking for the source. And what he found was not some anonymous voice operating in the shadows. What he found was a reporter. Someone who had been physically present during the pre-draft process, someone who had sat across from Shedeur Sanders, watched him interact with people, observed how he carried himself professionally. This was not a commentator speculating from a distance. This was a media member with direct access and direct knowledge of who Shedeur Sanders actually was behind the headlines. According to Deion, this reporter had seen Shedeur shake hands. Had seen him conduct himself with professionalism. Had observed, firsthand, that this young man was, in Deion's own words, kind, wonderful, and respectful in every interaction. Here is where Deion Sanders draws his line in the sand, and it is impossible to misunderstand where he stands. When the character attacks started spreading, when the narrative about Shedeur being arrogant, difficult, and a locker room problem began circulating through the football world, this reporter was in a position that most people never occupy. He had the truth. He had first-hand, direct, unambiguous knowledge that contradicted what was being said. He had a platform. And he said nothing. He did not push back. He did not offer the truthful picture he was uniquely qualified to provide. He stayed quiet. And Deion Sanders reportedly sat down with this reporter and asked him, directly and without flinching, "Did you speak up? Did you tell people what you actually saw?" Did you use your voice to defend a young man whose reputation you had personally witnessed being misrepresented? The answer, effectively, was no. And that answer is what ignited everything that followed. Deion made his position clear in terms that left absolutely no room for interpretation. He argued that silence, when you possess the truth and choose not to deploy it, is not a neutral position. Silence is participation. Silence is complicity. He reportedly used a line that has since been repeated and discussed widely among those following this story. A lie does not care who tells it, but it does need transportation. Deion Sanders, by choosing to stay quiet while a damaging narrative about Shedeur Sanders spread unchallenged through the football world, that reporter did not stay out of the story. He became part of the transportation system that carried the lie forward. That framing is important because it redefines what media responsibility actually looks like in a situation like this. It is not enough to simply avoid writing or saying something false. If you have knowledge that contradicts a false narrative and you choose not to share it, you have made a decision. That decision has consequences for real people. In this case, those consequences showed up in a draft room where Shedeur Sanders sat across from team representatives and told them he might not be the right guy for them, a sentence that may well have altered the trajectory of his professional career. Now extend this beyond the specific confrontation and look at the broader pattern Deion is identifying, because this is where the argument becomes impossible to dismiss. Every quarterback entering the NFL draft gets evaluated hard. Every elite prospect faces criticism. That is the process, and nobody, certainly not Deion Sanders, is asking for Shedeur to be exempt from rigorous football analysis. That is not the argument. The argument is about what happens when football analysis slides into character attacks, and more specifically, about the very different language that gets applied to different players displaying the exact same qualities. When a quarterback from a different background carries himself with supreme confidence, that confidence becomes a selling point. It gets labeled leadership. It gets called swagger. Scouts and media members describe it as exactly the mentality you want in a franchise quarterback. The confidence becomes proof of his readiness. But when Shedeur Sanders carries himself with that same energy, the language changes. Suddenly the confidence is arrogance. Suddenly the self-assurance is a red flag. Suddenly questions emerge about whether he is too flashy, too outspoken, too loud. The football did not change. The quality being described did not change. The language did. And Deion Sanders has been watching that language shift happen in real time, repeatedly, over the course of his son's entire pre-draft journey. He is not speculating about a double standard. He is pointing at a documented, observable pattern in how the same qualities get described differently depending on who is displaying them. This is why Deion's comment about the NFL itself carries such enormous weight. Speaking on ESPN with Stephen A. Smith, before millions of viewers, Deion Sanders stated publicly that after watching what happened to Shedeur during the pre-draft process, he has no desire to coach in the NFL. Read that again slowly, because the significance of it demands that kind of attention. Deion Sanders, a man who has been discussed as a legitimate NFL head coaching candidate for years, a man who transformed the Jackson State program and then the Colorado program, a man who has proven he can recruit elite talent and develop quarterbacks at the highest levels of competition, looked at the NFL system after watching his son navigate it, and said publicly that he wants no part of it. That is not a throwaway line. That is not an emotional response delivered in the heat of the moment. That is a man with Deion Sanders' competitive fire, his hunger for the biggest stages, his entire professional identity built around performing at the highest level, making a deliberate, public declaration that the politics, the media influence over front office decisions, and the narrative games being played behind the scenes of the NFL disgusted him enough to walk away from an opportunity that most coaches spend entire careers chasing. When someone with that profile says those words, it is an indictment of the culture he is describing. And it was delivered on ESPN, in front of Stephen A. Smith and one of the largest sports audiences in cable television. Here is what makes the timing of all of this so deliberate and so strategically precise. Training camps are approaching. A new NFL season is building toward kickoff. And the same machinery that manufactured a damaging narrative around Shedeur Sanders before the draft is beginning to spin up again. The same questions are surfacing. The same language is starting to reappear. And Deion Sanders is not waiting for it to gain momentum this time. Last year, the narrative had months of runway to build and take root before Shedeur could step onto an NFL field and answer it with his actual performance. By the time he could respond through football, the damage to how organizations viewed him had already been done. Deion is not going to allow that sequence to repeat itself. By going public early, by naming the dynamic, by putting the specific confrontation with the reporter into the open, Deion is doing something very calculated. He is making the messengers visible. He is putting the people who shape and spread narratives on notice that their choices are being observed, documented, and will be called out by name if necessary. He is forcing accountability before the narrative can quietly set the tone for an entire season. This is not an emotional father lashing out. This is a man who spent decades in professional sports studying how power, media, and perception interact, and applying every lesson he learned to protect his son's future before the window for protection closes. Through all of this, the character attacks, the draft room doubt, the months of narrative warfare, Shedeur Sanders himself has not folded. He has kept working. He has kept preparing. He has stayed locked into his process with a level of discipline and focus that speaks louder than anything anyone has written or said about him. There is a profound irony in that fact. The people who spent months questioning whether Shedeur could handle the pressure, the spotlight, and the scrutiny of professional football watched him absorb an extraordinary amount of pressure and carry himself with more composure than most veteran players would manage in the same situation. The storm that was manufactured around him did not break him. And Deion Sanders is proud of that. But pride does not mean acceptance. Surviving a manufactured storm does not mean you stop asking who built it and why. What Deion Sanders is demanding, at the core of all of this, is a straightforward thing: honesty. He is not asking for favorable coverage. He is not asking for his son to be protected from criticism. He is asking that the people who were in the room, who had the truth, who had the platform, use that combination responsibly. He is asking that confidence not be weaponized differently depending on who is displaying it. He is asking that a reporter who watches a young man conduct himself with class and professionalism be willing to say so publicly when that young man's character is being attacked in ways that directly affect his professional future. That is the standard Deion is holding people to. And he is holding them to it loudly, publicly, and with zero apologies. Source: Deion Sanders Public Statements, 2025. The story of Shedeur Sanders and the 2025 NFL draft process is not finished. It is actively unfolding. The season ahead will provide Shedeur with the most powerful platform he has ever had to respond to everything that was said about him, not with words, but with performance. And when that performance comes, pay attention to how it gets described. Pay attention to the language. Notice whether the same qualities that were labeled as problems during the pre-draft process suddenly become strengths when they show up on an NFL field. Notice whether the narrative adjusts, and if it does not, ask yourself honestly why it does not. Coach Prime has made his position absolutely clear. He is watching. He is documenting. He is not going quiet. And this time, he is not waiting for the damage to be done before he starts fighting back. If this story gave you a clearer picture of what Deion Sanders is actually fighting for and why it matters beyond just football, then take 10 seconds right now and hit that like button. It directly helps this conversation reach more people who need to hear it. And if you want to stay locked in on everything happening with Shedeur Sanders, Coach Prime, and the NFL as the new season builds, subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a breakdown. Drop your take in the comments below. Do you believe the media treated Shedeur Sanders fairly during the draft process? We read every single comment and we want to hear exactly where you stand on this.